We have our good friend, Senate Majority Leader Jack Johnson, in studio with us. And so without further ado, we'll get into the conversation, get into a dive on the special session, one that I was told, everybody that I talked to, including Jack Johnson, said, you know what? If we're here beyond a week, something has gone amiss. I don't know that I'm quoting you directly,
that's very close.
But I think that's pretty close. Hello, Jack Johnson. How are you?
Hello, Matt Murphy. Good to be with you.
Has something gone amiss?
Well, I would say so. I've participated in a number of special sessions. They are typically a 3 or 4 day affair, very limited in scope, a very finite number of bills, pieces of legislation that are to be considered. They are typically presented well in advance of the special session. So there's lots of time leading up to that 3 or 4 day period where you can look at the legislation, you can study it, you can talk to constituents, you can meet with stakeholders. And then by the time you drop the gavel to convene a special session, pretty much everybody knows where they are. You know if you have the votes to pass it. And so the special session itself ends up being more of a formality, 3 or 4 days, get through committees, and then you're back out. And that's just not what this has turned into.
It feels as if the Senate and the House, and I've expressed a little, mild frustration about this, but it feels like we're on different pages as to what we're trying to accomplish. Do you think that's a fair assessment of what's going on?
It is a fair assessment, and I think we've been on different pages for some time. The Senate has been very consistent, I would say, over the last 2 months, 3 months. The governor announced right after we adjourned the regular session that he was going to call us in. A date of August 21st was established. I think the Senate has been very consistent in saying, hey, we're not really sure a special session is needed, but certainly if it is going to take place, it needs to be very narrow in scope, very limited, like any other special session that we have. This one has turned into something far different.
So I had this speaker on last week, and we were talking about the different vision for the special that the House has versus what the Senate has. The Senate, as you mentioned, has been limited in scope, and it seems that you guys have been consistent in what you believe you've been called to do. And, some of you, let me ask you this. Let's start here. Is it fair to say that there are members of the Senate, and maybe members of the House too, but I want to ask you to speak to that, members of the Senate that do not believe that there's anything here that could not be accomplished in regular session? In other words, while it is up to the governor to call an extraordinary special session of the General Assembly, there are some that are a little confused as to what is so extraordinary about this call.
That is a very fair assessment, and there are a good many members of my caucus in the Senate that feel that way. But you're right. The governor has the constitutional authority to call us in. We respect that. And I will say the governor presented us with a series of really 6 bills and then an appropriations bill, which is somewhat of a different animal. It's more to do with funding, but 6 bills that dealt with substantive law. And there was a working group that had talked some over the summer about these bills. And when we came into session, most of us were very familiar with those items. And that's what we in the Senate agreed that we would take up. But we did not anticipate that 114 bills would be filed for the special session. 114. The House passed 30-something of those out of subcommittee in a matter of about 12 hours, maybe 18. And now they have 26 bills on the floor of the House that they're considering. And some of these are very complex bills. They have fiscal implications to the state, and you hit the nail on the head. And so the Senate has made the determination that we will fulfill our constitutional requirement to come in. We'll take up the governor's bills. We have done that. Effectively, 5 of the items, of the 7 items that the governor wished us to consider were passed, 5 out of 7. The other 2, we'll happily revisit those in January. But as far as these other bills, many of which none of us even saw until Friday or Saturday before we convened on Monday, no chance to talk to constituents, no chance to talk to stakeholders. We've suspended our rules, our notice requirements, so bills are going straight to committee and straight to the next committee and straight to the floor when normally there's a week in between these events happening. Mm-hmm. This is not the way to pass legislation in our view. So we've passed the governor's bills, or we've passed 5 of them. We need to adjourn and go home, and we'll happily revisit these other items when we come back in January.
Well, let me play you a comment from this morning on Nashville's Morning News. Belle, you with me over there? Give me a little eyeball. So Ken Yeager is the GOP party caucus chairman.
Correct.
Obviously,
Yes.
you're very familiar with Senator Yeager, and he was on with Dan Mandis, and this is what he had to say with regard to his understanding about communication between the House of Representatives and the Senate. Here we go.
But I want to tell you emphatically, really without reservation, that Senate Republican leadership is not aware of any such request. And I might add, Dan, that we're ready to sit down with the governor or House at any time. But I heard about this too on social media secondhand a few days ago. We have not received such a request.
That was regarding a request for the House and the Senate to sit down along with the governor's office to talk about the impasse. Here's how the Speaker of the House responded to Senator Yeager this morning on Nashville's Morning News.
I have the utmost respect for the Senate and Chairman Yeager. But what I do know is as we were talking last week around Tuesday, late afternoon, we ended up, the House and Senate, we asked to set up a meeting for Wednesday with the Senate and the governor. And I know my office directly reached out to the Senate counterparts over there and said, hey, we want to do a meeting and have the governor in there, and let's try to work this out. And I know for a fact we were told back, no, that if the governor's in the room, then that will just lock us down even more. And then I do know this weekend the administration, the governor's office, reached out to the Senate again and said, hey, let's have a meeting this week with all of us. And the answer again was no, it will just lock us down further on the Senate side. That wouldn't be a good idea. And look, if the Senate wants to meet with all of us, then I would ask them to reach out. If they're willing to, then they should reach out. But
that's Cameron Saxon from this morning's Nashville Morning News. Without comment, how do you respond to that?
As the majority leader of the Senate, I've received no formal invitation to sit down with the House and the governor. I spoke with the governor at length on Friday. He mentioned nothing about us all getting together. Now, the governor asked how he could be helpful, and we had a conversation about where the Senate was, but there was no formal invitation extended from the governor's office or to the House to my office about having a meeting. But I will agree 1,000% with my dear friend and our Senate caucus Republican caucus chair, Ken Yeager. Let's just put it to bed right now. If you want to have a meeting with the governor, we're happy to do that. Just invite us. Just send over a formal request. We'll be happy to sit down with the House and the governor.
Why does it feel like, and I made this analogy earlier today, that the House and the Senate, the majority in either body, is on opposite sides of the field playing a game to a victory for themselves against a loss for the other side, when everyone, I would think that everyone's on the same team here. But it just feels like there's a lack of communication, and I'm trying to get to the bottom of that. And look, I'm not trying to make enemies of anybody.
Sure.
I just don't understand the lack of communication.
Well, and let me be very clear that no one's an enemy. I'm not enemies with any of my good friends in the House. This is the legislative process, and it's certainly not the first time the House and the Senate have been in different positions on something. It seems to be a little heightened right now, if you will, in terms of intensity, because it's a special session, and we're supposed to be in and out in about 3 or 4 days, and it's gone well past that. So we talk all the time. But William Lamberth is one of my best friends in the world, and he is an outstanding legislator, and he and I talk 2 or 3 times a day. So there's lots of communication going on. But it's not going to change where the Senate is in terms of our belief that we've concluded our business. It's time to adjourn. Let's go home and let's start preparing for a regular session in January.
I'll use one of William Lamberth's bills. And I, have had an opportunity to sit down with William, and this is nothing personal, but I'll use it as an example of the danger in diving too deeply in what should be an extraordinary circumstance to call a special session, and it's the autopsy bill. It is an incredibly emotional piece of legislation. It's obviously emotional on the heels, especially emotional on the heels of the Covenant School shooting. But there are a lot of considerations about what this means down the road and in different circumstances. I don't know that this is the type of legislation that you want to fast track over a period of days, what ought to take a period of months to consider, to get public comment on, and to understand the full implications of passing a law such as this one.
Sure. And full disclosure, I'm the Senate sponsor of that bill.
Well, I mean,
I filed that on behalf of Leader Lamberth. But I will say, and I think he would tell you as well, this is an issue that he has worked on for a long time, working with the Covenant families. He asked me to file. It's the only bill I filed outside of the governor's bills. But I think you're right. And as the Senate sponsor of that bill, I've met with the Covenant families, and I respect their passion about it. But you have had some people who have brought up some concerns, some in my own caucus about that particular bill. And so I have more or less put it in the category with the others that I think it's probably something that is best deliberated in January.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I really applaud Leader Lamberth for the work he's done on that. But it's a good example of why we shouldn't go into a special session that lasts 3 or 4 days and take up dozens of bills. That's not the way a special session works.
So the governor had 6 plus the appropriations.
Correct.
And of those, the Senate passed 3.
We passed 4, three of the substance
and the
appropriations. And again, there was a 5th bill in there that, upon conferring with the department that brought us the bill, was not necessary. We might need to revisit it in January, but they don't need it. They came to us and told us that, so we were able to take that one off the table.
So, in terms of the Senate leadership and the body itself, you feel like that you have completed the task of the special session as called by the governor?
We have fulfilled our constitutional responsibility, and it's time for us to adjourn and go home and continue these very productive conversations we've had with some of our House colleagues. There are some really good bills amongst those other 23, 24, 25 that the House has passed, in addition to the ones that we have passed. And I think that many of those will pass whenever we come back in general session. But they need some time, and they need here's a key piece of this, Matt, that I want your audience to understand. When we're in special session, I mentioned this earlier, we've suspended our notice rules. And what that means is during regular session, there's a certain amount of time that must transpire before a bill is heard in committee, and then it's heard on the floor, or if it's in subcommittee before it goes to full committee. There's a reason for that. That's so that your legislature is not up there ramming things through without you, the public, the constituent, the voter, the taxpayer in Tennessee being able to fully understand and comprehend that legislation. That's why we must be very careful in these extraordinary special sessions. Again, the governor's bills were brought to us early on. I think there's been ample time for public discourse on those and stakeholders to weigh in. And so we were comfortable taking those up. But these other 100 some odd bills that were filed, 30 something that came out of House subcommittee, that's just too many for us to be running through in a very truncated special session.
For the edification of those in the audience, when we come back, can you just walk through the 3 that have passed the Senate? I think that's important. And someone on the super text line mentioned that. They said, I'm not familiar with the 3 bills. So let's talk about those when we come back. It's 1:18 almost.
Podcast wherever you listen.
Super Talk 99.7 WTN 122. A few more moments with Senate Majority Leader Jack Johnson discussing the Senate position on the special session, where we are and where we are going this week. And that has a lot to do with what the House of Representatives has planned for this week. It's my understanding there is a Republican caucus meeting that's going on right now, and they're probably getting a game plan together, one would presume. And is that how it works, Jack? The game plan is getting put together for what the House plans on doing this week. Over on the Senate side, that's just kind of a wait-and-see approach because both bodies have to decide to gavel out of special session. Is that correct?
That is exactly right. We go in on the floor this afternoon at 4 o'clock. The House goes in at 2. Again, we believe we've completed our business. We passed the governor's bill, or 4 of the governor's bills. Those are now over on the House calendar. We have to wait to see if they amend those in any way, in which case we would have to contemplate their amendments. So there's no more business for the Senate to transact other than to wait for those bills to come back from the House.
And this is kind of weedy in terms of how the sausage is made. But it's my understanding that there is a consideration on the part of the House to amend at least one of the bills in order to pull the Senate into conference committee, where they think they could open the Senate back up to considering some of the bills that they would like to see passed that the Senate has decided to pass on during the special session. Have you heard that, and what is the reaction to it?
I have heard that there's an amendment filed on the human trafficking bill. This is a very important bill. Our mutual friend Aaron Goldbergson with the Tennessee Faith and Freedom Coalition has worked very hard on this, was instrumental in getting the governor to include it in the call, and I really applaud he and the governor for doing that. And it is time sensitive. This is a good example of a bill that makes sense for us to consider. We want a report from the TBI on December 1st relative to where they think the scourge of human trafficking is in the state of Tennessee, so we can have that in advance of our session, which will begin in January. So it's a good bill. It makes sense. It makes sense to be considered during the special session. It's time sensitive. That report from the TBI, according to the bill that was filed, that the governor asked to be filed, I was the sponsor of it, along with Chairman Ken Yeager. That report is due on December 1st, and it's to be delivered to the governor and both speakers of the legislature, the Speaker of the House and the Speaker of the Senate. The House has filed an amendment. They haven't adopted it. That would simply say that report will only be delivered to the Speaker of the House and not delivered to the Speaker of the Senate or the governor. Now, that's what that strikes me as is a very petty, irresponsible thing to do on a very important bill. So I'm hopeful that the House will realize that how that looks, that you would jeopardize a bill so important relative to human trafficking by simply poking the governor and the Speaker of the Senate in the eye and saying that report's only going to be delivered to our Speaker. So I hope the House doesn't entertain that amendment.
Okay, that smacks to me of somebody wanting to elicit a reaction. And I'm wondering what the reaction would be. Would you think it would be getting you into conference committee? Is that right? Because obviously I can't imagine a world where the Speaker of the House would think that the TBI, right, Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, would present a report only to the Speaker and withhold that report from the Senate or from the governor's office.
And by the way, it's a public document, so exactly. So again, the amendment has been filed. It's not been adopted. It's not been moved or seconded. So maybe it was a mistake. Maybe there was some. I don't know. I don't know what the motivation of even introducing that amendment was, but there is that amendment out there that's pending.
Once again, this seems like, and I'm not trying to pull you onto the dance floor in regard to speaking ill of the other body, but that feels like a maneuver where I'm playing chess against someone, not playing with someone to further or advance good legislation that is important to the state of Tennessee.
Well, again, I hope that they don't take the amendment out. We can have a good, reasonable disagreement about what should and should not be considered, and I don't think ill of any of my House colleagues for feeling differently about that, be it Speaker Sexton, Leader Lamberth, or anyone else. I'm really good friends with all of these folks over there, and they're some of the finest people you'll ever meet. But we just have a fundamental disagreement about how this special session should be treated, so we've got to come to an agreement on that. I think the Senate is where the Senate is, and we've completed our business. So happy to have a conversation with the House about how we move forward towards January and these bills that we want to prioritize at that time.
Because of the disagreement about what should and should not be brought up, this seems like they're using the good legislation that everyone agrees on as a pick to get you to open up to discuss that other legislation that you don't feel like should be taken up in a special session. That's what it feels to me like.
If they contemplate and pass this amendment on that bill, that's exactly what's happening. That has not happened yet.
Okay.
And so I'm very hopeful that it won't. Amendments get filed for various myriad of reasons, and that's okay. It doesn't mean that they have to actually be taken up and be taken seriously. Let me just say this. Pass the human trafficking bill. Pass it as we sent it to you from the Senate. It's a good bill. We need to get that to the governor. We don't need that coming back to us on a message calendar or ultimately going to a conference committee.
And just to reiterate what Jack Johnson has already said, why is this so important now? You get the investigation rolling. You get the report out by December 1st. That gives the General Assembly the opportunity to handle it next regular session, to do what is necessary to eliminate or to reduce the amount of human trafficking going on in the state of Tennessee. And you do that during the regular session. This bill gets held up. It gets passed to the regular session. The report's not out until what? Next summer.
Possibly.
And then you're dealing with it in calendar year 2025 as opposed to the next regular session. Do I have that right?
That's exactly right. And I want to be clear. I don't think any of my friends in the House ultimately want that to happen. We are in broad agreement. The Faith and Freedom Coalition, they hosted a press conference. It was attended by numerous House members and senators. There were others that wanted to be there that had other commitments, but it was a real show of unity. Even though we may be divided, we came together in unison and stood on that stage and said, we are committed to bringing a robust package of legislation next year to fight human trafficking. We need this report in order to make that happen.
The other two pieces of legislation passed by the Senate. Talk to me about those two.
So one was to codify the governor's executive order relative to how background checks are performed. If you're convicted of a felony in one Tennessee county, and if you're not incarcerated, you should not be able to pass the background check, because if you're a convicted felon, you are rendered ineligible to purchase a gun. That information should be transmitted timely. It's already enforced now by a governor's executive order. We need to codify that. We don't like having statutes saying something different than what a governor's executive order says out there. So that's one bill. The other bill is relative to safe storage of weapons, with no punitive measures or penalties involved, but to do a PSA campaign to encourage safe storage, to reinstate the sales tax exemption on gun safes, gun storage devices. This is a really strong message to responsible gun owners out there to say, make sure you're safely storing your weapons. But we're doing it with a carrot and not a stick.
Gun ownership is a right, but it also comes with a certain level of responsibility.
That's exactly right.
That is expected. And I want you to offer a thought on this. Has the Senate seen any disruption? I understand the Senate and the House are two very different bodies. But the Senate has a gallery. Have you seen any issues? I know that your rules in the Senate are slightly different from the House. A lot of them overlap. But you kept the same rules in the Senate. Leadership kept the same rules in the Senate as they had in the regular session, right?
That's correct. We did.
Did you see any additional disruptions in the Senate?
We did not. And let me say this. We have had folks up there, and we welcome them, even when they're protesting us. I remember, I don't remember if it was Ronald Reagan or someone who said, he was looking out at a bunch of people protesting outside the White House, and he said, I love that. Somebody said, Mr. President, they're protesting you out there. They hate your guts. And he said, that's what makes America great. They can do that, and they're not going to be arrested. We love having people at the Capitol, whether they support us or they're opposed to us. We have had lots of people in our gallery, but they have been respectful. They've been civil. We do allow signs. They can be held at a certain, they can be a certain size, and lots of people bring in signs, and they are welcome in the Senate chamber.
I'm on the record as saying that I believe the sign limitation would pass legal muster, but I don't know if it would pass the smell test in terms of the court of public opinion. I'm not asking you to reflect necessarily on the decision making of the House, but would you agree that it could be perceived as a step too far by your body if you were ever to take up a sign limitation?
I think the rules we have in the Senate right now are appropriate. There's limitations. And by the way, the only reason we have a limitation on the size of the sign is basically the sheet of a paper, an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. And that's just so you're not obstructing the view of other people.
Yeah, if you get a big poster board out.
You're going to blind, then they get to fighting with each other.
Right.
So you can bring a sign, but it can't be beyond a certain size. I think that is reasonable. And I'm glad that we left our Senate rules.
Are there any content restrictions on the sign?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not aware of any. I don't know of any. If you had something profane or something.
Right.
There,
curiosity gets the better of me, because I said last week that I understand from a legal perspective how you might be able to limit it. The Congress of the United States of America limits the ability to bring signs into the gallery. They're also a ticketed body too, which I delved into over the weekend. But curiosity gets the better of me about content restrictions, because, there are other people in the gallery and you want a family atmosphere in the gallery.
Yes.
That's kind of where I'm coming from, is that are there certain things that are probably going to get you flagged and
with curse words? And,
that sort of thing. Right.
Yeah, that would probably be reasonable. I can't say with specificity what our rules say about that, though.
How long do you think you're going to be there? Hard to say.
I hope we can come to terms with the House sooner rather than later. What you said in the opening is absolutely true. If this session has spilled over into a second week, that's not a good thing for anybody. So I think it's time for us to adjourn, complete the bills that we agree on, that were introduced by the governor. Let's get those passed and get them to the governor's desk. They're good bills. We haven't talked a lot about the appropriations bill, but significant additional funding in there for some very important things. And we certainly agree with that. The governor asked us to take that up. Let's get those things done and continue the conversation over the next couple of months. We'll start filing bills for the next session here in the next couple of months. It'll be here before you know it. And that gives us time to really think contemplatively about what those bills do.
And I would say if there's any member of the House or if there's anyone associated with the House that feels like we've not been fair, all you have to do, tell me which bills the House is contemplating that are of such importance that they need to get done now as opposed to waiting until January. And I'm willing to listen to that. And I'm sure you are too.
Sure. Absolutely.
Jack, thank you.
My pleasure, Matt.